Hi there, welcome back to 19th Century Art. In this lecture, we're going to examine the picturesque and the sublime, the landscape in France and the US. As we began to talk about the landscape and its shifting value in art in the previous lecture, we talked about how this new perception of the landscape as a reflection of the world as it is now, and not just a timeless artifact assembled from bits and pieces of previous paintings, but actually looking at the world we are in and reflecting its changes as a way of talking about who we are at this moment. In France, Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot went to Rome, but instead of focusing on the antiquities in the museums, he was fascinated by the landscape. As a young artist of independent means, he was deemed unfit for the family business. He never visited Michelangelo's frescoes in the Sistine Chapel, even after 2 years in Rome. Instead, he found the shapes and the volumes and the space with the ruins far more compelling. Here is a rather lovely painting he did of Chartres Cathedral in 1830, and it's a curious perspective he gives us. In the foreground, we see these blocks of stone, the simple ingredients from which the cathedral in the background was made. He's calling attention to the environment. He's telling us something about not just this building, but the people there who built it and what it's made of. And in this way, it is given a unique focus on what we're looking at. Back in Paris, Corot came back to the demands of the art market there and began to create a lot of much more fanciful landscapes in the style that was popular, the neoclassical, pastoral, bringing in antiquities and metaphoric representations of the world. We can see that in his painting of the burning of Sodom. In this very dramatic way, the landscape reflects this powerful destruction, the smoldering city in the background, Lot and his daughters escaping through the wilderness, and a figure perhaps turned to ash standing in the path. It was rejected from the Salon, which prompted a protest by artists and critics. He resubmitted it the following year, and it was accepted. So these ideas of the landscape really come into focus when a group of artists decide to go out into the Paris surrounding countryside and begin to paint from nature. They called themselves the School of the Barbizon in a slightly ironic way. It wasn't actually a school. They hung out at the Auberge Inn, drinking and talking about their daily exploits of being out in the wilderness around Paris and painting the countryside and its people. Here, a painting by Theodore Rousseau. This is one of the earliest attempts at sort of painting in nature, doing lots of studies and then coming back into the studio and trying to capture the impressions of what they were seeing out in the countryside. Again, realism is the key focus here, just as we saw in the work of the British painter Constable, where he worked out in the countryside from sketches and brought them back to his studio. A similar plan was taking shape in Paris. We can see the desire to capture the emotional power of the sky and the careful attention to the elements, the wind and the moisture, the lightning. All of these things were brought into the landscape to try and capture a greater sense of immediacy in the painting. Here, Theodore Rousseau beautifully captures the glow of the sky and how it is reflected in the waters of the swamp. So Barbizon was just a short distance from Paris, and so this day trip by train offered an opportunity for these artists a chance to escape the confines and turmoil of the city and try and find something more enduring and idyllic in the everyday life of the people of the countryside. Here, Corot has joined the Barbizon School in his Georgic painting of cows feeding and watering in the countryside in the forests of Fontainebleau. Corot captures this luminous quality in the light where we feel the depth and the range of values beautifully captures this simple scene. The forest of Fontainebleau spread across 42,000 acres of dense wood, undercut with meadows, marshes, gorges, and sandy clearings. Bitterly cold winters and warm summers, coupled with heavy rainfall, encouraged the growth of a wide variety of tree specimens, a great attraction for these beginning landscape painters. Corot also painted the villagers here. He tries to capture with an elegant simplicity a unpretentious, ordinary girl in the countryside. A Woman with a Pearl is the title. Notice how he has brought into the composition a very close similarity to the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. In this way, he is telling us to see this country beauty just as we might look upon a lady of nobility. In America, as we mentioned earlier, landscape had this powerful draw because of so much of the land in America was untrammeled wilderness. And many artists were drawn to these distant locations as a way to communicate the great scale and beauty of this undiscovered country. Thomas Cole here beautifully evokes the boundary between the wilderness and the farmland in his very famous painting, The Oxbow, the view from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after a thunderstorm from 1836. Now, the Oxbow is a part of that bend in the river, that eccentric curvature that we see there that creates that drop-like shape in the midground. The foreground is this absolute tangle of twisted trees and mosses and ferns and the like. But in the distance, we can see along the river's edge farmlands and cities and towns. And Thomas Cole painted this with the very clear intention. He wanted to point out what was being lost by the advance of American farmers. And we can see he has placed himself into the painting on the side of the wilderness. We see him there as an adventurer exploring this uncharted territory beyond civilization, encouraging us to preserve and protect these lands. The Hudson River School was, like the Barbizon, a loose affiliation of painters who are all drawn to the American landscape. Frederick Edwin Church, representing the truly dramatic Niagara Falls, and one of the subjects of the Hudson School was to try and capture the extraordinary scale of the landscape in America. They were primarily selling to people who lived in cities in the East Coast, and they wanted to bring the full scale of this country back with them. George Caleb Beaming, working on the Missouri River, depicts these fur traders in this rather iconic image of them drifting down the river with their trade. the black cat ominously tied to the front of the boat, the package of furs, the boat deeply overladen with goods. The man in the back is wearing the Phrygian cap of the French revolutionaries, saying in a way that he is a man of great independence and self-made freedom. Albert Bierstadt had a remarkable ability to paint the luminous and towering qualities of the Rocky Mountains. In this incredible painting of Landers Peak, Albert Bierstadt shows us Native Americans camping by this lake, this beautiful waterfall pouring into the lake in the distance. Everything is pristine and clear and shockingly beautiful. Bierstadt worked from sketches in the countryside and then returned to his studio in the East Coast where he produced these giant 6-foot canvases. If you actually look at what Landers Peak actually consists of, you would notice that there is a fair amount of invention in Bierstadt's work. He was selling to an audience that clearly had never been to Wyoming and probably never would go to Wyoming. And so his paintings filled their imagination with the wonders of a far-off land. Bierstadt went as far as California. He painted the Yosemite Valley. This is actually one of a smaller study that would become, again, a larger painting based on his drawings. The really wonderful way he's captured the qualities of El Capitan into the valley of Yosemite. It's important to remember when we look at landscape paintings of the 19th century that they represent a longing for a simpler past. They tend to overlook the real conflicts and the real challenges that exist in the modern world. Here, Bierstadt is created a work called The Last Buffalo. In a way, it is reminiscent of the sublime paintings of George Stubb, a lion attacking a horse from 1765. The Native American is in a life and death struggle with the buffalo in the foreground. And yet, this painting with its corpses of buffalo and skulls represents a disturbing fiction, because at the time it was painted, there are probably more buffalo in this painting than there were actual buffalo in the world. It was estimated that in 1800, there were about anywhere between 30 to 50 million buffalo that roamed the Great Plains. But over the 19th century, their population was decimated by frontier whites who were migrating in great numbers, inspired by manifest destiny. It was only through dramatic action that the buffalo of the Great Plains were spared the fate of the California grizzly, the Atlantic gray whale, the great auk, the carrier pigeon, and the ivory-billed woodpecker, which all became extinct. There were fewer than 100 buffalo in 1900, but now their numbers, due to strict conservation, have returned to about 30,000. This is one of the important lessons of the 19th century, was that Americans came to realize almost too late that this vast, extraordinary, and richly fertile country had its limits, and we had to learn to conserve and protect the lands we cherish.